Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events. This week I sit down with Laurel Fletcher, director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic and law professor at the University of California, Berkeley. During our conversation, Laurel talks about the history of the Guantánamo Bay prison, her book, Guantánamo and Its Aftermath, and Guantánamo's impact on many of its current and former detainees. Welcome to the show. Today I'm in Berkeley, California with Berkeley law professor Laurel Fletcher. And Laurel, thank you for taking the time to talk to the listeners about your professional background in Guantánamo. Welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by learning a little bit about how you got interested in the subject of the Guantánamo prison. Was there a time in your life when that subject became particularly interesting to you and you knew that it was something that you wanted to dedicate some of your academic interest in learning about and researching?
I don't know that any American or person living in the United States or affected by U.S. policy after 9/11 that wasn't in some way affected by those events. And I sit here in the university and I direct an international human rights law clinic, which uses the resources, intellectual resources of a world-class research university and the practical skills of exceptionally talented law students at a top 10 law school in service and promotion of human rights protections. So that's what I do. When the news about how the United States was responding to the attacks on the United States after 9/11 by resorting to a new interpretation of international law, which justified the capture of the so-called enemy combatants, right? An entirely new category in international law. To take those men, remove them in Afghanistan, put them in a legal timeout zone for purposes of preventing them, essentially from preventing them for rejoining the fight against the United States, was just simply unprecedented and deeply disturbing. The opportunity to get involved in that didn't emerge right away. Right? I mean, so first of all, you have to I think now it's probably hard to remember back that there was this time when we didn't really know what was going on, right? There was a tremendous amount of fear. The first wave of detainees weren't transferred until 2002 was when the first group of detainees were brought from Afghanistan to Guantánamo. And at that point, it was even trying to figure out, so who were these individuals? What had they really done? And if you'll remember, the administration had come out and they'd characterized these men as being the worst of the worst. And there were the photographs released of these men in orange jumpsuits, right, with kneeling with hoods, and then being put in what were essentially these open air cages, right? And that it responded in some sense on an emotional level to the sense that we had been attacked as a nation, and this was part of the fight. And we were, the United States was taking the fight and defending our national security, and that justified this treatment. At the same time, those images were incredibly shocking and disturbing. Right? If we think about the traditional laws of war and the need to treat your enemy as you want your enemy to treat your own combatants, right? That if those had been U.S. service members that had been treated by who are being held by a foreign country, we would have been completely up in arms, right? The fact that we weren't was deeply disconcerting from a point of rule of law, right? Because as a lawyer, right, and an international lawyer, the rule of law is the kind of primary tool that we have to enable a even-handed approach to the most severe human rights violations. Right? Is to say that there are agreed upon rules and norms. Everyone follows it. It's in everyone's interest to do so. Right? It says something deeply disturbing about who we are as a nation if we, the United States, are able comfortably to erode those standards. Right? What does that say about us?
Right.
Now, at the time, that was not a popular position. Right? And it wasn't until Abu Ghraib, really, when I think the American public stopped to consider, like, well, wait a minute, what really is being done in our name, right? There still had not really been much known about what was going on in Guantanamo, but now news started to come out, right? We see the images of Abu Ghraib. At that point, the U.S. Supreme Court hands down one of the first decisions that starts to say, well, wait a minute, there are rules that start to apply here.
Right.
And that then opens up this opportunity to then start to look deeper. There's more now. Lawyers now are being able to represent those who are detained in Guantanamo and to try and shed light on that area of confinement and say, like, well, what's really going on there? Who really is down there? Because remember, all we had was information at that point from the government. Right. Okay. So that's sort of just to kind of take us back to that point in time of what was going on. Sure. So in the clinic, we always have to ask ourselves, well, what is it that we can do? What can we contribute that's unique here? Right. The Center for Constitutional Rights was really one of the first organizations that took the lead with a legal response to Guantanamo, right? And they had ended up filing the Rasool decision, which, if you'll remember, that was the decision that said there is the need for legal oversight. We this idea of habeas corpus, right? Show me the body. Right. You United States government need to justify why you are detaining these individuals, right? And that was the legal vehicle that they used to do that. So after Rasool decision came down, right, so in conjunction with Abu Ghraib, that started to open this up, right? When you had the court say, wait a minute, we're able now to take a look at this. They mobilized lawyers to then start to represent Guantanamo detainees, right, once the Supreme Court had paved the way for that. So then again, things now start to kind of snowball. It's very difficult. It's still difficult to get down to Guantanamo. I have not been able to visit Guantanamo. The Department of Defense keeps a very tight hold on who goes and who has access. Because we work within a law school setting with students, I'm always trying to ask myself, what is it that we can do that's of great service and will be of an educational benefit to our students? In this particular context, it didn't strike me that it would provide the kind of opportunities that I thought would be best for students to involve them in a representation of a single Guantanamo detainee. Other law schools have done that, but I didn't feel that was where we could make the unique contribution. So we kept sort of looking for, so what is it, right? It sort of stood there, as I say, as a human rights clinician, I couldn't ignore, no one was ignoring that was happening. It was looking like, okay, so where is it that we can make a unique contribution? So now we get through the first Bush administration. We are into the second Bush administration. Things are not going so well in Afghanistan. That kind of, the blush is off the bloom here, and there's increasing criticism. There's an increasing awareness within the Bush administration that actually maybe these aren't all the worst of the worst. And now there's a public relations problem. There is this sort of a bunch of detainees have been released. More information is coming out about it. People are talking. This doesn't quite seem to be as justified as it did. And there's news that the Bush administration is actually trying to shrink the population at Guantanamo. Because they realize that it's really not militarily justified, and it's a huge kind of PR, public relations kind of disaster. The questions then starts to arise among lawyers for Guantanamo detainees. What happens next? Right? So we're going to push to get these detainees released, but then what happens to them? At that point, I think that's a question that we can help answer. And we link up with the Center for Constitutional Rights and our Human Rights Center here at Berkeley to start to really answer that question, because there were no data about who actually, we knew something about the men who were in Guantanamo. What happens after they get released? And if the administration wants to shrink that population or to potentially, close it down substantially, then that's a question that deserves attention. And as an academic, we were interested in, how has Guantanamo actually affected all these men who now have been released? So at that point, so now we're in 2006, right? 2006, 2007. We decide that we're going to do this study and sort of answer that question to try and peel back the seal on Guantanamo to look at what is that experience like from the perspective of those who have lived through it.
Right.
Because aside from what attorneys had been saying about their particular client, there hadn't been any generalization about and looking at patterns of experience. So because the Center for Constitutional Rights had this network of habeas attorneys, that enabled us to identify men who are willing to talk about their experiences. So then we conducted over the next 2 years a study, we ended up interviewing 62 former detainees in many countries. We interviewed former guards at Guantanamo. We interviewed habeas attorneys for former detainees and policymakers across the board to try and get that picture. And so from that, we then produced this study and a subsequent book that provided that snapshot. And what we learned was both confirmed some things that I think that people thought, but we were able to put some both numbers on that and fill that in with a richer narrative, right? So first of all, like looking at, how did all these guys actually get there, right? And there you see that much of it was just the wrong place at the wrong time. When the U.S. dropped these flyers down in Afghanistan that was offering essentially a bounty for Taliban and Al-Qaeda, that essentially became carte blanche for very, very impoverished communities to turn over people who were to whom they owed no allegiance, right? Like if you were a foreign national, you weren't part of that community, and get $5,000. That is a lot of money. It's also became kind of convenient to resolve property disputes, right? And so we had, a number of those that we interviewed describe their conditions as either being like, I was trying to get out of Afghanistan, and then so a lot of them were caught in Pakistan, right? The Pakistanis that and then turned over to Pakistani authorities, right? For bounty, that's what they were then told. They were, brought in. Oh, we're going to house you for tonight, and then being turned over to U.S. forces. Or people who said, it was my cousin, or it was my neighbor, and when I actually got out, then they apologized for this, right?
So when these bounties were offered, did it literally just take the word of someone who was in a community going up to a U.S. officer and saying this person is questionable or a potential terrorist?
Well, so that's certainly from the detainee perspective, that's all that it was. In other words, they were not given the opportunity to present evidence or had access to an advocate to say or have any kind of investigation that was done, right? I mean, they're turned over and then immediately they're in U.S. custody. They get transferred from one military base to another military base, and then they get into Guantanamo. Right. So that's and then on the back end, right? So you might say, well, that you could be sort of skeptical about that. Well, that's just their story. Maybe they really were. How do we really know? Well, the fact that all of these men that that were released were not released as a result of a U.S. court order, right? They were all cleared for release. In other words, the U.S. military went through its own procedures and decided that they posed no risk, right? And so without the benefit, without ever having been convicted of a crime or subject to court order to release them, the U.S. decides to release people. So... right. So based on that, it was that the evidence would strongly suggest that these guys were not, were never posed a serious threat.
Right.
And then you have some pretty damning admissions, right? That's documented in we cite to it. It's documented in other work that talk about quotes from U.S. officials saying that most of these guys don't even deserve to be here, right? So, now remember, what Guantanamo really is an interrogation facility, right? The point was which is why it needed to be a law-free zone, because the laws of war put strict regulations on the conditions under which you can question captive combatants.
So for many of these people who are detained and then are shipped to Guantanamo, they get on an airplane, they have no idea where they're going, they land in Cuba, and what happens to them? What's the story of after they get off the plane, after they get released into this prison? What's a day in the life of an average detainee look like?
So that depends on what time you're transferred in, right? In the early days, you're literally in this kind of outdoor kennel with exposed to the elements, right? Completely open to the elements. So when it's raining in a tropical zone, you're getting rained on. With rats and other animals, running through your running through your cage, and you're with a bucket for a toilet and being fed, 3 times a day with pretty fetid, horrible water. That's not great. That gets a little better when then you get upgraded to converted shipping containers. And there you have, so then you have some protection. You have a roof over your head, right? It's still open to the front, right? So you have no privacy. And remember that the vast majority of these men are observant, practicing Muslims, right? Where modesty is kind of a strict cultural norm. So this idea that you are very exposed creates tremendous distress and stress. Now, those are just like the facilities, and then things kind of improve a little more, and then you get, then you're getting solid cells, right? On the other hand, you are also isolated, right? I mean, that's what comes with as things get more regularized, right? What detainees will talk about is actually Camp X-Ray was the open air, the first ones. They'll have detainees say, actually, you know what? I really didn't like being exposed to the elements, but we could all talk to each other.
Yeah.
We could see each other and we could talk to each other. When we get moved in to these converted shipping containers, then all of a sudden we have a wire mesh in front of us that and we're cut off. We can shout to one another, but it starts to feel isolated.
Right.
So that's just kind of the physical overlay.
Were most of the detainees waterboarded or tortured in some other way other than just the horrendous conditions that they were placed in?
So this is something that I think deserves a little bit more of an explanation, because certainly the issue of waterboarding is something that's captured the press, and there are what are called the high-value detainees, and that's where you have allegations, and admissions of who was waterboarded, right? Generally in black sites, not in Guantanamo, right? But before
elsewhere.
Before they get to Guantanamo. Now, what do we mean by torture under international law?
Right.
Not the U.S. interpretation of torture that prevailed at some points in time during this Guantanamo era, right? We've gone back and forth on that. Currently, we're in a better place on torture. The idea of extreme, infliction of extreme pain and suffering, right, is torture. Also prohibited under international law, which the U.S. is obligated itself to, is cruelty. Right? So there's a spectrum there. A lot of the discussion has been like, what is or isn't torture, and ignored that there is a whole range of behaviors which are also considered illegal cruelty. The fact of so then you have to start looking at the practices. What practices can be considered torture, and what acts are considered cruelty? That's where we looked at the effects of the whole system of confinement at Guantanamo, right? So we did not interview any person who said that he was waterboarded, right? We interviewed men who were subjected, as everyone was subjected to, just the standard procedures, which included short shackling, which included being put in stress positions, which with forced nudity, forced shaving, these ways in which the conditions of confinement were just institutionalized humiliation.
All of them.
That's just what it meant to be in Guantanamo, right? So you'll talk, for example, going to just being taken, from your cell into interrogation, right? What that experience was like of being short shackled, of then being put into either a hot room or a cold room, being left for hours, then being interrogated, then being put back in your cell, right? The arbitrary punishments that were meted out by guards and what those would like, so that then you would be put into isolation, right? You could be put into isolation for up to 30 days for having possession in your cell of unauthorized object, which could be as simple as an extra apple, right, that was in your cell, right? Then then being in isolation for 30 days, that in and of itself can exert over time what we call the cumulative effect, right? So that you have to look not just at what were the isolated interrogation or conditions of confinement and their impact on an individual, but look at what happens over time. And what psychologists and psychological studies of torture say is that you can have the accumulative effect of all of those conditions, which will push someone over the edge into the extent of experiencing the effects of extreme suffering and torture. Right? It's just people. That's what sort of people feel when they get, quote, pushed beyond the breaking point. So that and it's that experience of the cumulative effect that is also a violation of our obligations for how we treat people under, torture and illegal cruelty.
With all of the what seemed like gross violations of international law that took place at Guantánamo, where are we now? And have there been any reparations to the people who were there? And what's the future look like in terms of what's reasonable with regards to the existence of Guantánamo, its continuation in the future?
It's a great question. There's a lot there. Let me see let me see how I can answer that. We're in the twilight of the Obama administration. The U.S. is now being reviewed by the UN Torture Committee to asking the U.S. how is it upholding its obligations under international law specifically with regard to torture. And the committee is asking the United States exactly some of these questions. So what next? Are you going to provide, as you should under international law, an opportunity for individuals to be compensated for the illegal torture and cruelty? So this is what the Obama administration needs to respond to. So far, they have elided an answer, and what is possible. And so legally, it's required. Whether the U.S. is going to recognize that and act on it, I think is still very much an open question. I think that this kind of international review and scrutiny serves to remind the Obama administration of the promise that the president made on his first day of office to close Guantánamo has not been met. And that, remember, this is a president who was elected in part on his pledge that he was going to do things differently, that he was going to restore the U.S. to its rightful, prestigious place within the community of nations as a leader in values of human dignity and more cooperative relations. So I think that the Obama administration has been stymied in part by Congress and Congress's intransigence. I think that the Obama administration has wanted to do more in terms of shrinking the Guantánamo population, but it is not clear that the administration really has an end game here, other than keeping permanently or indefinitely detained a smaller number of high-value detainees. In addition, there's about 120 other detainees in Guantánamo that have been cleared for release that cannot be placed. Most of them are from Yemen. And I think that continues to be a blight on the U.S.'s pledge as being a nation that abides by the rule of law. So where we're going from here, it's not entirely clear for me. I think the Obama administration can do more. I think that it should live up to its promises to lead with American values, which include saying that when we have made a mistake, when we have mistreated those that we to whom we have made an obligation not to mistreat, that we need to make amends. Mm-hmm. That day is still waiting.
Yeah. Laurel, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to the listeners about Guantánamo.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about the Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.